We'll be looking at Genesis chapter 22 this morning. And verse 1 says, sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God called. Yes, he replied, here I am. Who likes a test? You know, when you was in school, did you like to take tests? I didn't. Do you like to take the test of life? We'll have to say again, no, we don't like tests. And yet, they are necessary. Because you don't know what you really think you know until there's a test. Peter said, these trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is in being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. Don't like tests, but tests are necessary. Abraham had been given a promise, and he waited 25 years for the promise to be fulfilled, for Isaac to be born. And Isaac was born, and he became the apple of daddy's eye, and then God put him to the test. Which does he love more? Which is he more loyal to? Does he love the promise and the blessing more than he loves God? You know, every promise that God had given hangs on this test. In Genesis 12, he was called to leave a land that he knew. He was called to leave the homeland and go to a place he didn't know. In Genesis 13, he had received the promise of land and descendants. In Genesis 15, he got a promise for an heir. In Genesis 16, he was promised more descendants than can be counted. In Genesis 17, he was given a covenant and promised a son. In Genesis 18, he was promised that he would become a great nation through whom all would be blessed. And in Genesis 21, Isaac was born. And the fulfillment of every promise hangs on this test of faith and obedience. You know, it's easy for us to wonder why God tested Abraham at all. You know, didn't God know everything there was to know about Abraham? Yeah. Does God know everything there is to know about us? Yes, he does. But you see, the test wasn't about God. The test was about Abraham. God wanted Abraham to see the main object of his spiritual loyalty and love. So, at about 115 to 120 years of age, Abraham was still having soul-searching experiences. You know, I think that kind of tells us we're never too old to face new challenges. We're never too old to fight new battles. We're never too old to learn new truths. Truth is, when we stop learning, we stop growing. And when we stop growing, we stop living. Abraham was still learning. And the thing is, our faith is not really tested until God asks us to bear what seems unbearable, to do what seems unreasonable, and to expect what seems impossible. And that's what God was asking of Abraham. He was testing Abraham's faith and his hope and his love. And on the surface, it looks like God was wiping out everything he had promised to Abraham and now everything that Abraham lived for. But in this test, we see Abraham's faith, and there's some things we see in this faith. One of the first things we see is a sacrifice of faith. God said, take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. So again, we see Abraham being called by God to go. You know, in Genesis 12, he was called to leave his homeland And now he's called to go. And the neat thing here is just a little something for you to learn. The same Hebrew word is used for leave and go. The same word, God is asking the same thing of Abraham in here as he was in Genesis 12. To go. And he calls him to go and to sacrifice or to give his only son, the one he loves a whole bunch. You see, what he was asking of Abraham was to give his all, to hold nothing back. And that's what God asks of us. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus told the rich man to go and to sell his possessions and give the money to the poor and have treasure in heaven, and then come follow me. And the rich man couldn't do it because his money got in the way. Now here's Abraham being asked to sacrifice his only son to give his all. And that's what Romans 12:1 is all about. It says, so dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. The way we really worship is giving God our all, holding nothing back. And so the sacrifice of Isaac that God was calling for was an act of worship. He was to be a burnt offering. And a burnt offering shows the worshiper's total dedication to God. In the old sacrificial system, when they had the burnt offering, the priest didn't get any of that. The people didn't get any of that. There were some offerings where the priest could take some meat from the fire, and others where the people were to save some to eat for themselves. But the burnt offering was totally God's. They couldn't keep any of it for themselves. It was an act of worship. And God is commanding Abraham to give back to God what he has received from God as a gift in its entirety. He wasn't to hold anything back. So it was a sacrifice of faith. We also see that it was an obedience of faith. The next morning, Abraham got up early. He saddled his donkey and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son Isaac, and then he chopped wood for the fire, for the burnt offering. And he set out for the place God had told him about. The next morning, he got up and began making preparations. What is often our response? Sometimes I'm afraid our response begins, why, Lord? Why am I going through this? Why am I having to face this? What's going on? Can't this go away? Come on, God. Why me? That's another question. Why me? Why not somebody else? Why am I having to do this, God? Why? You know, the fact that we ask for explanations suggests that we may not know ourselves as we should, or that we don't know God as we should. Because faith does not demand explanations. Faith rests on promises. That's where Abraham was. He's resting on a promise. So he got up early. He got everything ready to go. There was no hesitation. There was no prayer for new guidance or a prayer for a new direction or prayer for new instructions. He had his instructions. He knew what he had to do. And so for all intent and purposes, Abraham already offered his son Isaac on the altar of sacrifice to the God who had given him. He got up early and he set out. You know, through the years since leaving Haran, Abraham didn't always get it right. He didn't always, there were times he strayed from the true direction of God's will. But he had learned to trust God. The author of Hebrews tells us that when Abraham didn't know where to go, he obeyed God and left home. When he didn't know when everything was going to happen, he lived by faith like a foreigner looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. When he did not know how it was all going to happen because of his old age, he believed God would keep his promise. And when he did not know why, he was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Hebrews 11:18 says that even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Isaac was the promise. And he didn't understand why. He didn't understand all the reasoning, what was going on, but what he knew was he must obey God fully. So on what could Abraham depend? Could he depend on his feelings? Oh, no, our feelings are as fickle as anything. Our feelings may have us up on a high 1 minute and down in the lows on the next minute. We can't depend on our feelings. He couldn't depend on other people. Oh, as much as we would like to depend on people, even people we really love. Let's face it, sometimes they let us down. Sometimes they disappoint us. We really can't depend on people. There are just some things in life we must face alone, and it is only then we can see what God can really do for us and through us. Abraham could depend on the promise and the provisions of the Lord. God had made a promise, and he was standing on that promise. And because of that, there was an expectation of faith. And on the third day of their journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. "Stay here with the donkey," Abraham told the servants. "The boy and I will travel a little further, and we will worship there, and then we will come right back." There's something I want you to notice here. We cannot read this story and say Abraham had it all together and he was just gung-ho and good. Because if you notice, what did he call Isaac in this verse? He didn't call him the son, he called him the boy. It's like he's trying to distance himself a little bit to make it maybe just a little bit easier on himself of what he knew he had to do. So think about that. 3 days journey. 3 days to think about it. What was going down? What was going to happen? You see, as we look at this, Isaac was dead in Abraham's mind for 3 days. He knew what he had to do to obey God. And on the third day, he tells his servants to stay, and we will go, and we will worship, and we will come back. He's going to sacrifice his son, and they're going to come back? But that's what Abraham told them. Hebrews 11:19 said Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. You see, Abraham had already experienced the resurrection power of God in his own body. Paul tells us that's in Romans chapter 4. Abraham's faith did not weaken, even though at about 100 years of age, he figured his body was as good as dead, and so was Sarah's womb. Abraham never wavered in believing God's promise. In fact, his faith grew stronger, and in this he brought glory to God. He was fully convinced that God was able to do whatever he promises. Too old to have kids, and yet he had a son. See, Abraham knew that God would raise Isaac from the dead if that was his plan, and if not, God would come through for him in the future in whatever way God desired and deemed necessary to do. You know, we face the daily demands and trials of life, the test, and sometimes situations seem hopeless. When it does, we need to ask ourselves the very question that is asked in Genesis 18:14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Whatever it is you're going through, is anything too hard for the Lord? And then we need to remind ourselves of Philippians 4:13. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Do we really believe that? Do we really believe that we can do anything through Christ, especially those things that He's called us to do and He's asked us to do? Do we believe we can do it? You see, in doing that, that's part of faith too. There's the work of faith. James tells us the faith without works is dead. In the story of Abraham, it says, "So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders while he himself carried the fire and the knife as the two of them walked on together." There is this solemn work of faith. Isaac carried the wood. Abraham carried the fire and the knife. If you go back to what we call the faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, it does not say they had faith and did nothing. It doesn't say they had faith and they took it easy. It says they had faith and they worked. Abel brought an offering. Enoch worked with God. Noah built an ark. Abraham obeyed. He carried the fire. He carried the knife. He did the work of faith. And because he did the work of faith, there was that assurance of faith. And Isaac turned to Abraham and said, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. Nice to see he's calling him son again, isn't it? "We have the fire and the wood," the boy said. "But where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" "God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son," Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. Did Abraham think God was going to supply a substitute? Probably not. Did he expect to find a lamb or a ram on the mountain? Probably not. You see, in Abraham's mind, Isaac was the lamb God provided. Isaac is who God asked for. And Abraham is willing to forfeit all, even his only son, the one he loved, if that's what God called for, and it is. So whatever the outcome, Abraham says God will provide. And because he had this assurance, we also discover the persistence of faith. When they arrived at the place where God had told him to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it, and then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. You know, here we see not only the faith of Abraham, but we also see the faith and trust of Isaac. Because it's really believed Isaac was probably a teenager about this time, and Abraham would have been 115 to 120 years of age. At any point in time, Isaac could have ran. At any point in time, Isaac could have overpowered his father Abraham. At any time. It really seems that Isaac trusted Abraham the way Abraham trusted God, no matter what he required. And so he allowed himself to be tied up. He allowed himself to be laid on the altar. Abraham built the altar, arranged the wood, tied up Isaac, laid him on the altar, raised the knife. You know, there is no doubt Abraham is going through with the sacrifice that God asked for. And when we experience all these parts of victory, our faith, we find the victory of faith. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Yes," Abraham replied, "here I am." "Don't lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son." Then Abraham looked up and saw the ram caught by its horns in the thicket. And so he took the ram and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. And to this day, people still use that name as a proverb: on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Can you imagine the outcome if Abraham's ear had not been in tune with the voice of God? In the midst of his obedience, in the midst of his faith, doing what God called him to do, he was still listening for the voice of God. Still listening. Folks, there's no point and no place and no time that we can become so comfortable and so complacent that we stop listening for God's voice. he heard the voice, and God provided a ram for the sacrifice needed for worship. Whenever God calls us to a difficult task, a test, He will provide all we need to meet it. Because of Abraham's faith and obedience, all the promises given were guaranteed by the Lord, and they worshiped, and just as Abraham said, they returned. You see, Abraham passed the test. But this story calls us to ask some questions like, where is our loyalty? Where is our love? God wanted Abraham to learn what he could only learn by such a test. You see, I really believe in Abraham's mind, he believed he loved God totally. But yet he really didn't know it until the test. Abraham had to come to a decision concerning his relationship with God. What is the basis of my relationship with God? You know, do I love God because of what He's done for me? Or do I love God because of who He is? It's an important question to ask. Because the thing is, any love that is performance-based is inadequate. For it will stop when the performance stops. Genuine love must be rooted deeply in the character of the one loved. So they are still loved, and they continue to love, even if the performance does not continue. I'll tell you, I'm glad for God's blessings, aren't you? I'm glad for His blessings upon my life and my family and the church I attend. I am thankful for God's blessings, but would my love still be as deep if the blessing stopped? That's the question. Now, I don't think God's going to cut off His blessings. But if He did, would I love Him as much as I do? Or I think I do? You see, we don't love God for what He does for us. We love Him because of who He is. Abraham loved God with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength, with everything he had. And when the test was over, God knew Abraham served Him with everything he had, his whole life, and Abraham knew it too. He may have thought it before, but after the test, he knew it. How about us when the test is on? What is the basis of your relationship with God? When the test is on, what is your response? 1 John 5:4. It says, "For every child of God defeats this evil world, and we achieve this victory through our faith." Do you pass the test? You know, as I thought about this, that old hymn we used to sing a lot came to my mind. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world. We don't like tests, but they're part of life. And when the tests come, they will test our faith. And what will it reveal to us about our relationship with God? I trust you will find you love God because of who He is. And it will grow just a little bit stronger. And you will love God just a little bit more, even though you're loving Him with all you got. And you go, how do you do that? Just love harder. Jesus died on the cross so that we could have faith in God. Not because of His blessings, but simply because of who He is. Because He desires for us to have a faith that overcomes. A faith where we're willing to sacrifice, but yet a faith that we can know the assurance of God's working in our life. A faith that we know will result in victory if we remain faithful. And so this morning, as we share in communion together, think about your faith. Jesus said to do this to remember Him. So as you receive this morning, and as we will partake in a little bit, think about your faith, the strength of your faith, and how it is your faith that results in you being a child of God, because it trusts in God's grace that saves you. Gentlemen, would you come?